Today we're going to talk about citations, footnotes, annotations. We're going to talk about their history, why they matter, and why there's a specific way to cite your sources. The university library has a page dedicated to them, but that's not the only place where we talk about them, and that's really not the only place where they matter. I've written an informal piece on Zen and the art of citation. I've given you an additional link to a great webpage that has a myriad of examples of sources and source citations. Now, why do I care so much about footnotes, and why do most historians and scholars care about footnotes? Well, in the context of this class, it's important to recognize that digital zombies have real issues with footnotes. Digital zombies, in fact, don't really think about footnotes, and perhaps they don't think at all. But the interesting thing is that the history of annotating text, which is essentially what a footnote is as old as zombies. And perhaps it's even older than zombies. Let's think about a really old text. The Bible is by no means the oldest text, but it's quite an old text. And this image gives you just an indication of the many different versions that the English version of the Bible, the English translation of the Bible, has had. Now, the Bible was not written in English. It was not written in Spanish. It wasn't written in German. It wasn't even written in Latin. So every Bible that you've ever had your hands in is at the very least a translation of a translation of a translation. And then it's also a sort of a revision of one of those many translations. Now, if the authors of those many translations and those many revisions hadn't kept track of how they changed the text as they wrote it, we'd have a very difficult time tracing back to the original text. And we wouldn't really be able to understand why these changes had happened. So annotations are really a way for readers of a text to understand where that text comes from. How did it end up looking the way it looks in their hands? And in a sense, it gives them a way to understand the role of the author in that text, right? Who is the author of the Bible? That's a good question. It's certainly not the person who translated it. Now, this image that you're looking at comes from Wikipedia. And the text that you see on the screen right now is also an annotation. URL tells you where to find a previous or the version of what I'm looking at. So in a sense, I'm giving you a citation here. Now you know that this image that I've shown you previously can be found at this URL. And while we're on the subject of Wikipedia, if you look at the bottom of any article, any reliable article in Wikipedia, you'll see a list of references. And those references look a lot like the source citations that we've asked you to put in your texts. These are not the only annotations, right? References, or if some people could call this a bibliographical notes, I call them footnotes. Essentially, all these this is a footnote format of a reference, is the way in which the authors of this article tell us where they found this information. Now, a Wikipedia article has many authors, and so there are many other forms of annotations in a Wikipedia article. In the top right corner of any Wikipedia article, you'll see an option to read, to edit, which only editors can do, and you too can be an editor, and to view the history. If you click on that, you will see the many people and the times at which they edited the article on the list of English Bible translations. It gives you a tremendous amount of information. Now, are these footnotes? No. Are they annotations? Yes. Do they provide us with information about how this text came to be? Do they provide us with information on how to look for specific versions and changes to that text? Yes. These are annotations. This is precisely what the purpose of an annotated text is. And any annotation in a text really is to give us the history and the source and, in a sense, the clues as to how this analysis, this text, this information came to be in front of us. There are many different ways of annotating. Here's on the left side of the page, you see an image, a screenshot of the electronic version of World War Z. The highlighted blue titles will lead you to those titles. Those are not exactly annotations, but in any digital version of a book, you'll see many different types of annotations. We'll see these in a second. But let's start with Rap Genius. So here, this is a screenshot of the annotations of one of the vignettes, chapters in World War Z in Rap Genius. And if you go to this page, and here it is referenced, yes, this is an annotation, you will see that this line is highlighted. And it's essentially in the text, it talks about a baseball from a Cincinnati Reds catcher, Johnny Bench, unknown to me. But now I know that ESPN called him the greatest catcher in baseball history. This annotation does two things. It gives you information about something in the text, and perhaps more important to our purposes in this class, it connects this fictional story of a zombie apocalypse to real people and real events, right? It doesn't make the story any more real, but it connects it to a historical primary source that is actually current and exists. It is not a fiction. Rap Genius is an annotation tool. The writing or the sort of the translation of lyrics and the many versions of song lyrics, all those are annotations. So if you go to Rap Genius and you just look at the song lyrics and what people say about those song lyrics, those are annotations. Some of them will occasionally have the shape of a footnote in the same sense that you would footnote a text. Not all of them, but I want you to see the connection between those two. So in this digital text about Flemish paintings, there's a little one after the name of the city of Utrecht with a footnote. It's not citing a source, but it's adding information that is not pertinent to the sentence in the text, but that is relevant to any reader. And so this is another way of thinking about annotations. Annotations are not just there to tell me what book you got the information from. There may be certain elements that you're discussing that don't make sense in the paragraph, don't make sense in the sentence, but in a sense are kind of like an aside, like something you'd whisper in my ear during the talk. It's relevant, but it's not pertinent. And so you'll put that in a footnote as well. We'll go over this in a little bit more detail. Not all footnotes and annotations and side notes have to be digital. So here's an example of sort of traditional book annotating. It's just literally just by writing it on the text. Annotations, marginalia. Marginalia is specifically so the doodles that you write on the side of the book. These have themselves become a source of fascination by historians and literary critics because in many ways, what's written in the sides of the book, the annotations, the footnotes, can sometimes be the most interesting part of a book. Now, I'm not suggesting you only read the footnotes, but the footnotes are really a really important part of anything you read. These are annotations in transcriptions of holy texts, and I can't exactly read, but if I take it from the text that I read to get this image, they're in fact jabs at the holy text. They're making fun of scripture and doodling on the sides, and this is some pretty beautiful doodling. I imagine you'll agree, and much better than the flowers, 5-petaled flowers I usually doodle. When you highlight a book, you are also annotating. You're not writing anything down, but you're conveying to future readers of that book, be it you or anybody else if you're highlighting a book in a library, what mattered to you. Now, this might not actually be an important part of the text, but it mattered enough to you when you were reading it to highlight it. That is an annotation. And in a digital book, you'll find them too. If any of you have read Kindle, you will find you have the option to identify or to have the system show you which parts have been highlighted and annotated by other readers. And this is a really interesting way in which annotations in the digital world become a community exercise. If you annotate a book, and it's your book, chances are nobody but you will see those annotations. If you're annotating a library book, then whoever borrows that book will see it. But you won't really connect with them. In a digital reading context, you might actually be able to have conversations with other people about that specific paragraph that all of you, perhaps hundreds or thousands of you, have highlighted in the same book. And this is where annotating becomes more than just a way of highlighting what matters to you, but becomes a conversation between the reader and other readers, and, if the author is still alive, a conversation between the reader and the author. And footnotes are also a way of communicating when you're writing something, a way of communicating, the author communicating with the reader. The author is communicating what matters, in a sense, the text, the sense of the book. But the footnotes will say, I also want you to think about this. As I said, it's sort of like an aside, like think about this matters. Then you'll have the source references, which are the author's obligatory mentioning of here's where it's coming from, here's who I'm quoting, here's who inspired me, here's where you too can find this information. When you get comments from your TAs in your texts that you've submitted and uploaded to the system and that we use to grade, those are also annotations, right? We are giving you feedback in the form of annotations in the text. Ultimately, the ones you really care about, right, the ones you want to get right so that you get the most points in your assignments are the footnotes, the citations. And there are different ways of doing it. As I said, some footnotes are side notes, right? They are comments on what has been written. They might be comments on the footnote that follows. They may be references for future reading. The number 2 point in the top square that I'm showing you here essentially repeats what I just said. Often the most interesting information is found in the footnotes. And I very often start reading a book by reading all the footnotes. But I think that's an occupational hazard. For your purposes, what you want to start doing is citing the sources that you are using in the footnotes. And you will do that, if you look at the second square, very much like the footnote number 1 does it, right? You follow a specific form to convey to the reader where this information came from. Now there are footnotes and there are endnotes. Endnotes are essentially footnotes that are all at the end of the document as opposed to being at the bottom of the page. And we have referenced different style guides like the MLA, the APA, CMS, that's the Chicago Manual Style. That's the one you care about in a history class. And I am not doing this to drive you bananas. This is not my intent to make life harder for you. In fact, the point of style guides is to make life easier. Yeah, you probably don't believe me. Trust me, if you follow the style guides, life will be easier. Let's think about this. Is it easier to find a book in a soup or if it's really well organized? Look at the library and how they've organized the books. Is it because somebody just needed to line them up? No, it's because otherwise if they were just thrown in the library, you'd never find them. Well, your footnotes are a little bit like that. If you just throw all the footnotes, all the information anywhere, I don't know where to find it. So the reason why they need to be structured in a certain way so that we know where to find the information, not just that it's going to be at the end of the page, but also we need to know that you know that the first thing you write down is the author's last name. Because that way, it's very easy for us to know where to look to find out who you're citing. There's a reason to this madness. Essentially, if you don't have the instructions, you're not going to be able to put together your Billy bookcase. And if you don't understand the reason behind the citations, if you don't follow the instructions of how to cite, it's going to be really hard to put together your essay. So, what is it that's supposed to get cited? Right? Let's just get down to brass tacks. Well, you need to cite the direct quotations. If you are putting text from someone else in quotation marks, they better be followed by a footnote, a little number, and at the bottom of the page where that specific sentence comes from. Try not to quote entire paragraphs. Just go for the quote. If you collected information, but you're not citing it exactly, you're going to have to tell us where you collected that information. If you're using an idea that isn't yours, if you're inspired by someone else's writing, you need to tell us who that is. And this is where you'd write a footnote that is in a sense a reference, where you might say, I join so-and-so in developing this concept of. If you are paraphrasing, right? If you see someone's sentence and it's really beautiful, but you can't quote it exactly, so you write something similar. You're going to have to paraphrase. You're going to have to tell us where that paraphrase comes from, who inspired you. And you have to do that because otherwise you are going to get cited, if you know what I mean. You're going to get a ticket, and it's going to be in the shape of less points on your essay. The important thing in order to prevent plagiarism is not to cut and paste. That is just the worst. And a really good way of avoiding that is to annotate everything that you read, right? Keep notes on what you read and cite what you write. If you annotate what you read, when you're writing on that, when you're writing about what you've annotated, you'll know where you got it from, and you'll be able to cite it correctly, and then you'll be fine. Now, I hope that you understand where the history of this comes from. Humans have been annotating and referencing each other in written works for a very long time. And you are going to continue in this tradition, but not as digital zombies, right? Not as writers who play willy-nilly with authorship and ownership of authorship. You're going to cite, knowing full well that you're joining a long tradition of authors and writers who respect each other and cite each other.